Hello, fellow freelancers. Today I'm going to talk to you about how to look for words, search for terms, expressions, and stuff that you don't know. And this is especially for you beginner translators out there. What do you do when you come across a term or expression or a word that you're not sure about and you're not really sure how to translate it in this context or in this situation? And how do you go ahead? How do you proceed in this situation? Now, a couple of things. I'm going to assume that you're a beginner. I'm going to assume that you're kind of first starting out. So I'm going to assume that you don't have your own glossary already, and also that you're not operating with a CAT tool that has its own built-in glossary or dictionary, just because I want to keep it simple. So this is for you people who are, just starting out and you kind of want to know how to proceed in these situations. So let's get into it. So I should say that these are the steps that I tend to follow, and so you might follow different steps, or you might do them in a different order, or there might be other things that you wish to do, and that's fine. I just want to give you the steps that I usually follow in the order that I usually follow them in. Again, here, this is broadly, generally speaking, and it'll depend on the situation, but let's go through them. The first thing I usually recommend is, well, to have a dictionary. In fact, I actually recommend having 3 dictionaries, if that makes sense. First of all, in your language combination, if you're an Italian to English translator, you should have an Italian-English dictionary that you can use. Secondly, you want a dictionary, obviously, in your target language, but I also recommend having one in your source language. And the reason for this is that it just never hurts. And over time, over the years, you're going to be consulting these dictionaries. You're going to be consulting a combination of them, and sometimes this dictionary, sometimes that, and it never hurts. And in fact, over the years, it does help to look up certain terms because you see the etymology, you see synonyms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's good to have these dictionaries. You can have them in physical form, you can have them in digital form, however you want them, doesn't matter. But to have these dictionaries, I do recommend having all 3. And at least to have them at your disposal, have them handy, because that's always helpful. So the second thing, and one that I find very helpful, probably the most helpful point, is to look on websites like Lingue and Reverso. What are Lingue and Reverso? Well, these are 2 websites that offer translations of certain terms or words or expressions, and they show the source of the translation. So you can look up something and see that it was used by the EU in certain legislation, and you can see how the EU translated it officially. And this is very helpful because it allows you not only to get the translation, but to have the source of it, so that if the client ever asks, well, are you sure about that translation? Like, where do you get that from? Would you really want to use that? You can always back it up. And, as a translator, you have to back up every single word you use pretty much. I mean, actually, literally. With this method, then you can be 100% sure about backing it up. You can be like, this is the term that was used by the EU or by certain banks or whatever it might be. And so you can be that much more sure about what you're using. Now, the ones I use most often, again, are Lingue and Reverso. These work well for me because of my language combination. It's always been Italian to English, and I work in business and legal fields. However, depending on your language combination, your specialization, my guess is that there is another website that can deal with it. If you deal with, say, Chinese to Korean and you're in the medical field, I'm sure there are other websites, there are other places that offer similar services. And so you should try to look these up, because these types of websites will be extremely valuable for you. The next step I recommend is checking out the dictionaries on pros.com, Translators Cafe. There are other ones. Word Reference is another place I like to go. But these dictionaries are built up by other translators, and they're built up over time using, we'll go over later about the forms and stuff like that. But they're built by other translators like you over time, and actually they have very good dictionaries and glossaries there, especially pros.com. I like it a lot. And actually Word Reference. It depends, what you're going for exactly. But I highly recommend, and if you look up pros.com in a certain term, or pros.com and Glossary, I think it'll pop up, and same with Translators Cafe. And I recommend going and doing a search on these to see if you can find whatever term or expression or even phrase that you're looking for, because it might be there. So the next point I have, and this one's going to land me in a bit of hot water, is machine translation, like Google Translate. I know a lot of translators, we're supposed to be against Google Translate and hate it and all that, but I mean, Google Translate's a good tool. It's a very dangerous tool for people who don't know what they're doing and just assume they can use any type of AI or machine translation or whatever and completely disregard everything else. But for people who actually do know what they're doing, things like Google Translate can be very useful. And so I'm not against using machine translation as a tool to help you out. I think it shouldn't be your go-to, and it obviously shouldn't be one of the first things you use, and you shouldn't rely on it. But to use it as an extra tool, it can be useful. Just keep in mind, obviously, that it makes plenty of mistakes, no matter what the language combination is. And secondly, obviously, that nothing you post onto the text, into the text box of Google Translate remains anonymous. You know, it all, and it's in their policies, and I've talked about this in other videos, but basically Google retains ownership of all the text that you put in. And, you know, they say they try to make it anonymous in terms of who puts it in there, although apparently the IP address and the time and date still show up. But the fact is, if you're dealing with a law firm, a hospital, a government organization, or dealing with a company's, you know, financials or something like that, basically anything that your client would not want to be made public, you shouldn't be putting it into that text box. Now, there are other types of machine translation like DeepL and whatnot who claim to have more secrecy built into them. So, you know, once again, as you get to know how these things work, they can become more useful, but you need to know how they work. And for the novice, these can be very dangerous, but for experienced translators, it can be an extra help. So why not use the extra help if it's already there? The next step that I like to follow is to actually just do Google search for the term. So if I'm looking for a certain term and I want to know how it's said in Italian, let's say, then I'll look up whatever the word is, and then I'll add Italiano in brackets or something like that. And usually, you know, it'll pop up either some dictionary like Treccani or one of those, you know, the online Italian dictionaries, or something else like someone else will have tackled it in the past. And so just do a Google search for your term plus the language that you're translating it into, and see what pops up. And that, you never know what website you'll land on and where it'll take you, and it could be something helpful. The next step I recommend is forums. And by forums, I mean forums like on pros.com, and I briefly mentioned them before. Pros.com has its own glossary, its own dictionary, but also has forums where people get into discussions about these things. And so feel free to check out these forums where people might have discussed different ways you can translate this. So like it's statuto, sometimes it's article of association, sometimes it's translated as bylaws, which situations you should use this or that, etc. And these can be very helpful. So my recommendation is to go on to these. Translators Cafe also has its own forum, and obviously Word Reference as well. You usually find a lot of discussion under you know, when people ask questions about these. And so definitely check these out to see if your particular expression or term has been discussed before. And then what I recommend after this, like for all these terms, by the way, if you found your solution already, you don't need to keep going, obviously. You know, if you found your solution early on, then you can stop and you don't have to go on to the next step. But if you're still not sure about it, then keep going. And my recommended next step at this point is to ask the question in the forum, because these forums are extremely helpful, like I said. And so if you ask the question, say, look, you have to search for it ahead of time. People get annoyed if you ask for something that's already been asked a bunch of times. But you can say, look, I searched for this, I didn't find the answer, and I would like to know what the, you know, how you can translate this expression or term in this context, et cetera, et cetera. And I found them to be extremely helpful. People there, they'll respond very quickly, and they're very helpful, and they'll get into debates with each other about what the right term is and everything like that. And so I do highly recommend doing that. If you can't find your answer anywhere else, then absolutely ask it in the forum. And this pretty much solves, in my experience, this has always solved my problem. with one exception, which I'll get into because that's the last step. But yeah, these forms, I think for the vast majority of you, by the time you get here and you ask it in the form, you'll have found your solution at some point here. Now, the very last step is to contact the source itself. And you have to be careful about this because as a translator, you don't want to be contacting the end client because this pretty much null and voids any contract you had with your agency. In fact, it kind of blacklists you for that agency and for all the other ones, because you shouldn't be doing that. It's a breach of contract. But what I have done in the past is I was dealing with certain government terms of the Swiss government, and I shot them an email as a student, and I said, I'm a student, I'm curious about this, how I see you have this term in French and German, but I'm wondering what term you use usually in English or in Italian or whatever the language was. It must have been English, and so the lady replied, and she was actually very helpful, and so I found my solution there. But I had to do it anonymously. I can't do it saying I'm doing a translation for so-and-so or this, that, and the other because, you just can't do that as a translator. But worst case scenario, you can try to find a way to contact the source itself. And here it was the Swiss government and try to see how they would translate a certain term. Or, it might be a company or something like that, but you can try saying you're a student or, I don't know, something along those lines and seeing if that works. Like I said, I've only done this once in my life. I don't think I've heard of another case where someone else has done it. I haven't really asked around. But by and large, you won't need to get that far. By the time you get to the forums, you can usually find your solution. But I just wanted to point it out there as an extra thing on top that you might be able to try under certain circumstances. And that's pretty much it. Using these methods, you will be able to find the solution to your question. What's the preferred search term, et cetera, et cetera. And to reiterate, I am assuming that you don't have your own glossaries. And by the way, when you're first starting out, you should know that many times when you're performing a translation for a company, they'll give you their own glossary. So obviously, if the term isn't there, you can search for it there already, and that's understood. But these are for terms that you don't have access to at the beginning in your own glossary and one provided by the client or in a CAT tool or something like that. I didn't want to get into all that stuff and just keep it simple for those of you who are just starting out. And but yeah, that's pretty much it. If you have any other method that you like to use, please feel free to let me know. Otherwise, I will talk to you next time. Okay, thanks. Bye. Savedum.